If you are in a situation of inequality, of violent inequality, probably the most effective technique ever invented to not only make that seem moral, but to make it seem like the victim is to blame, is to frame it in the language of debt. Mafiosi understand this perfectly well, right? But sort of heads of conquering armies, you come in, you say, all right, I've conquered you guys. And it's actually important to bear in mind here that there's a famous line from Benjamin Franklin, there's nothing certain in life but death and taxes. That's not actually true. It's only death. In many societies, ancient Sumer, communities didn't tax themselves. Taxes were just placed on conquered populations. The same was true in Athens. In fact, they had negative taxes in Athens. The government gave you money. You were paid to vote. Just gave periodic handouts from government resources. Rome had bread and circuses. So citizens didn't usually have to pay taxes. Taxes was tribute placed on people who'd been conquered, but the general excuse was debt. You owe me your lives. Why do you owe me your lives? Because I could have killed you and I didn't. So, of course, I expect payment for this, compensation. I'm a nice guy. I'm going to let you off the hook for 6 months. And, if you're in trouble, we can negotiate something, but I do expect payment. And, voila, you've turned a relation of violent inequality into a relation where the victims are running around feeling inadequate all the time, making terrible apologies for themselves, and you get to be the magnanimous, nice guy. It happens over and over again in world history, and it's very, very effective. The problem is it tends to blow up in your face. Because, from the perspective of power, there's that little worm in the bud, which is, you're translating things into the language of a business deal, which implies that you should be equal. You are equal on some level. If you owe a debt to someone, there's a contract here, but one party has failed to live up to their end of the contract. Now, if you think about it, there's a real explosive potential there. And if you look at world history, in fact, the vast majority of rebellions, revolutions, insurrections, peasant revolts that you see are not about the kind of thing you probably think it would be. They're not about slavery. Slave revolts happen, but they're pretty rare. They're not about caste systems. They're not about serfdom, absolute declared systems of inequality. They're always about debt. Moses Finley, the great classicist, once said that there was basically one revolutionary program throughout antiquity, which is cancel the debts and redistribute the land, in that order. When peasants take over a town, the first thing they do is they find the debt records and burn them. After that, they go after the land registers and maybe the tax documents. And this remains true throughout history. I was actually going through just recently some of the writings of John Adams and others of the founding fathers, their reflections on democracy, which of course they were totally against. Those guys hated democracy. And John Adams has this quote saying, well, we can't have majority vote. If we had majority vote, then we have 2 million people with property, 9 million people without property. What's going to happen? Moment we allow everybody to vote, first thing that's going to happen is they'll cancel the debts. After that, they'll redistribute the land. It's just common sense. So this is the program. And why debt? Why does debt mobilize people in this way? Because it implies that you're equal. So, if you say you are inferior, you're a peasant, if you're a serf, I'm a lord, it's not going to make people very happy, but you can live with that. But if you say, well, you're supposed to be my equal, but you messed up, you are morally inadequate, well, it's kind of hard not to take that and say, now, wait a minute, if we're equal, why are you saying I messed up? Who owes what to who here, really? And that is, of course, what people have said for the last 5,000 years when confronted that. Almost invariably, the response is, who owes what to who? But once you do that, you're using the language of debt, right? You're saying that debt is morality. You're saying, well, wait a minute, we make your food, in terms of any reasonable morality, I'm the guy. You should be owing me rather than me owing you. But suddenly the language of debt does become all pervasive because you have to use the master's language. And I think that's what we're dealing with all those religious texts, of all this philosophical text, which start by saying debt is just morality and then say, except actually it's not. You're stuck with the language of debt as a way of arguing about politics. We don't know what if this is 2000 BC in Mesopotamia and two guys are sitting around the tavern arguing about politics, what kind of phrases and language they're using. But we can be pretty certain that debt is a big one in there. And we can also be pretty certain that when we're reading all these great religious texts, that language of ordinary, everyday political argument is in there. The thing is, we don't have this anymore. So we're probably reading all these sort of Mesopotamian equivalent of "it's the economy, stupid," or all these various catchphrases that everybody knew at the time that we just don't know anymore. So they're just throwing them around and it becomes lodged. And this is why all this moral language becomes this financial language. And you talk about redemption and reckoning and so forth, and debt and sin and so forth and so on. So you're stuck with this language of debt, except it periodically blows up. Next, when I started looking at the broad sweep of history, I thought, well, you can look at social movements and organization of society in those terms, and perhaps one of the most revealing ways of doing that is looking at the history of money itself. Remember, we have this paradigm. First there is barter, then there's money, then comes credit, and that's wrong. Not only is it wrong, it's actually backwards. Credit comes first. Somehow or other, by the time the sort of curtain comes up around 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, you already have very elaborate credit systems. Actually, the very first document we have, which talks about interest rates, is a political document by a king, Temna, I believe is his name, a Sumerian king, who's complaining about his neighbors occupying a stretch of territory which is rightfully his. And he says, well, they've been occupying this land for 20 years. If we calculate the rent we would have charged them had they been renting the same land, and then add a compounded interest rate, I calculate that they would actually owe us, 13 trillion shekels, or whatever, some insanely sum that no one could possibly pay. Obviously, this means war. So, you've already got compounded interest rates and so forth going on in the very, very first records that we have. People have expense accounts, bar tabs. It seems like almost all everyday transactions are on credit. And the evidence for that is scales, because they were denominating debts in silver, but they didn't actually make scales accurate enough to weigh out the tiny amounts of silver that would have been required to buy like a shirt or a hammer or something like that in the marketplace. They had the technology to do so. They just didn't bother. So clearly people weren't actually using silver to buy this stuff. They were running off a tab. All right, so you've got this Sumerian situation. But the same king, what he does after he declares war on Lagash, or the rival place, wins. And what does he do after that? He declares a debt cancellation. Because it seemed, for everybody in the kingdom, because it seems that the problem you have these credit systems, money is basically in a set of IOUs denominated in silver, although silver, unless you're merchants dealing with large transactions, rarely actually changes hands. The problem is in bad years people fall into debt. Because also these silver and grain are fixed in relation to each other. That's what money actually is, but that's a big problem. If if there's a bad harvest, the price doesn't go up. You're stuck. The farmers fall terribly into debt. As a result, people start taking away their flocks, taking away their fields, taking away members of their family. Debt peonage becomes a huge phenomena. They start running away, joining nomad bands outside the city. Society seems to be breaking down. So kings will normally come in and sort of declare a clean slate. All right, commercial debts can stay on the books usually, but consumer debt will wipe them out and start over again. This becomes a habit and becomes systematized in the biblical Jubilee every 7 to 49 years, depending on your reading. Debts are wiped out, everybody gets to go home. In fact, the first recorded word for freedom in any human language is the Sumerian word amargi, which literally means return to mother, because that's what happens. They declare debt cancellation, all the debt peons get to go home. So this virtual money system comes first, which is always very entertaining because people have this tendency to write about virtual money as a new phenomena. We're in this brave new world. Actually, it's the original form of money. Coins come later. Barter, incidentally, tends to only really show up when you have people who are used to using money but actually can't get their hands on any. So you do have documented places where people do say, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow, but in almost every case, it's something like, Russia in the 90s, where the economy falls apart, or the money supply vanishes, and people are trying to carry on as if they had money without money. Or in a prison, they turn cigarettes into money because they're all used to using money. Now, here's the interesting thing. Coins are invented nearly simultaneously. It happens first in Lydia in the Eastern Mediterranean, but shortly thereafter, at least in broad historical terms, it happens in the Ganges Plain in northern India and in the plains of northern China, Ganges Valley, I'm sorry. And in every case, through different physical techniques. In one case stamped, in one case cast. But the social situation seems to be the same, which is that money in the physical sense, currency, is actually invented to pay soldiers. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it, because gold and silver are what money is denominated with, and you can use it for exchange, but it just isn't usually done. But soldiers are exactly the sort of people who are most likely to be doing this. First of all, from the perspective of a soldier, gold and silver has a huge advantage over a credit arrangement, because you can't actually steal a credit arrangement. You can't run off of it. On the other hand, gold and silver, it's kind of your equivalent of the suitcase full of $100 bills. Nobody knows where it's from, nobody asks, anybody will take it. So for soldiers, that's very nice. You can also melt it down, divide it up into small portions. So soldiers are likely to be carrying around loot. And second of all, if you have elaborate credit arrangements as the major way of transacting, well, a heavily armed guy who's just passing through is probably the person you'd least like to extend credit to if you can possibly avoid it. If he's carrying around little bits of gold and silver, well, good. So cash markets, insofar as they seem to first emerge, will tend to emerge right around wherever armies are parked, or where they have recently looted things and are, trying to get rid of the little bits of gold and silver and acquire the wine, women, and song and various other things that they like. Governments very quickly get in on the deal, and in fact, one interesting thing is by the Adam Smith account, if money just sort of emerges from the need to get over the inconveniences of barter, well, it would be very hard to understand why governments demanded taxes in money. It might seem self-evident, but the moment you think about it, it isn't, because if gold and silver are just money, well, why not just grab the gold and silver mines? And in fact, governments would do that. Ancient kings would normally grab the gold and silver mines. In theory, you have all the gold and silver you want, you got all the money. Why would you then take the stuff, stamp your picture on it, give it to people, and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one of these back again? Think about it, it's kind of odd. But it makes perfect sense if you're trying to feed an army. Here you have this army of 100,000 people. They're sitting town on the border. Well, how are you going to get food to them? Under ancient conditions, unless they're next to the ocean, where it's easy, relatively easy to move stuff around, it's extremely difficult to move around large amounts of grain. They're going to eat everything within walking distance in a matter of weeks. So what are you going to do? Either you have to employ, another 100,000 people just bringing them stuff, or you can give them all tiny little pieces of metal with your picture on it and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one back. Voila, you've just employed your entire population, getting soldiers things they want. And that's essentially what taxation systems have done throughout world history. Colonial empires did this very, very self-consciously, like in Madagascar, where I was. First thing the French did, they said, okay, we've just conquered you. That was very expensive, outfitting an army, or you're going to have to pay us back for the cost of having conquered you. We will issue paper money, and you'll have to give, 10 of those back to us every year. It was a way of creating a market. Somehow or another, you're going to have, they actually called it the moralizing tax, to teach people the value of work. So money and taxes have been used throughout the centuries as ways of creating markets, which is very interesting because we have this assumption that markets and governments, and particularly war-making governments, are opposed principles, and that political choice for the last century or so has largely revolved around which one we're going to slant to? Are we going to go more on the government side, more on the market side? Those are the two sort of logical human possibilities. Ever since people like Herbert Spencer wrote in early 19th century, we've always assumed there's an opposition between these things. Historically, in fact, no. Markets tend to be created by governments as a side effect of military operations.